Hello and welcome to this episode of Heterodox. Charles I, Blessed Charles, the last Emperor of Austria-Hungary. Very fortunate today to be joined by the one, the only Charles Coulombe. How are you, sir?
Very well indeed. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. I'm sorry, everyone, for the slight delay. There are a few technical problems, but they've all been resolved now. We were just to the point of giving up, but everything has been resolved. So we're going to give this a go. Yes, Charles, just before we start, do you want to introduce your book and your history with this topic? Because this is a bit of a passion project for you.
Well, it is. It was a real joy to write. I've always been a fan of Charles I and of the Habsburgs in general. It was very fortuitous, really, that I'd already resolved to come to Austria to study when my then editor, the late John Morehouse, Tad, God rest him, asked me to do a book on Emperor Charles. And as it happened, since I was coming over here anyway, it worked out perfectly. And it became quite a different thing than if I'd written it at home, because, of course, over here I was able to walk in his footsteps and visit many of the scenes of the high drama that marked his life, and the light spots of the tragedy as well.
Wonderful. So, if your book obviously starts with an overview of what you term the imperial idea, and you have other chapters in your book dedicated to the sacred monarchy and Austrian piety. So just before we get to the character of Charles himself and his early life, would you like to give us a quick introduction as to why you think the Austrian Empire is so significant, and what the institution of the emperor, the emperorship itself, really came to symbolize?
Well, this is very, very important, really, to understand Charles as a man. The imperial idea basically is something that's been with humanity for a very, very long time. The Roman Imperium was itself the heir of various developing ideas of empire. The notion, and again, I've got to make something very clear. We moderns, when we think of empire, we think of oppression, we think of control. There's a whole band of academia for whom empire is a synonym for Satan, which is unfortunate because, of course, it's wrong. But in truth, empire was seen as a means of maintaining local liberties under a large framework. And the people who really invented that kind of idea were the Persians, who came up with the notion of administering their subject peoples through those people's own leadership, rather than like the Assyrians and earlier folk, just basically smacking everyone around and wiping them out if they were in the way. Alexander the Great and his successors added to the idea and went into Greek culture. And then came Rome. And toward the last of its period, the Roman Empire became the Christian Roman Empire. And there's where our story really begins, because the idea of the emperor, the Roman emperor being the, how would one put it, the temporal leader of Christendom. And again, we have to get away from our modern ideas of leadership being oppression. You see, you really, if you want to understand Emperor Charles, you can't look at him through our unusual and peculiar eyes. Leadership in this sense, rule in this sense, was seen as something done for the benefit of the subjects, not the ruler. Now, obviously, as with everything else in life, there were people who didn't live up to the ideal, kind of like, I don't know, today. But they had a very high ideal, and a lot of people tried to attain it. Now, this Roman imperial idea had several, for want of a better word, incarnations. Eventually, the Byzantine Empire, of course, the Holy Roman Empire, and through various historical permutations, the Western imperial idea came to rest in what we call Austria-Hungary. And that that was what Karl was heir to. The idea that the emperor rules not just by the grace of God, but in a certain sense at God's sufferance, that he exists for the sake of his peoples, that he has to put them above himself. Now, this was in the medieval Christian idea. This empire was at the apex of similar Christian monarchies: France, England, Scotland, Poland, Naples, and on and on and on. And all of these, and the empire itself, derived their legitimacy and their authority from their connection with the church. The coronation rites, the ideas of chivalry, they all fed back and forth into the same notions of sacrificial leadership, of the best of leaders attempting to imitate Christ himself.
On that note, Charles, there's a excerpt in your book where you detail the Primates' prayer in the Hungarian coronation rite. I think just to exemplify what you're talking about, I just want to read this excerpt. And again, if you hadn't had the chance to read Charles's wonderful book, a link to purchase it is in the description. Almighty and everlasting God, creator of all things, commander of angels, king of kings and lord of lords, who caused your faithful servant Abraham to triumph over his enemies, gave many victories to Moses and Joshua, the leaders of your people, exalted your humble servant David to the eminence of kingship, enriched Solomon with the ineffable gifts of wisdom and peace. Hear our humble prayer and multiply your blessings upon your servant, whom in prayerful devotion we consecrate our King, that he be strengthened with the faith of Abraham, endowed with the meekness of Moses, armed with the courage of Joshua, exalted with the humility of David, and distinguished with the wisdom of Solomon. May please you in all things and always walk without offense in the way of justice. May he nourish and teach, defend and instruct your church and people, and as a powerful administrator, a vigorous regimen, against all visible and invisible powers, and with your aid restore their souls to the concord of true faith and peace, that supported by the ready obedience and glorified by the due love of these, his people, he may by your mercy ascend to the position of his forefathers, and defend by the helmet of your protection, covered with your invisible shield, and completely clothed with heavenly armor, he may in total victoriously triumph, and by his power intimidate the unfaithful, and bring peace to those who fight for you, through our Lord, who by the vigor of the cross has destroyed hell, overcame the devil, ascended into heaven, in whom subsists all power, kingship, and victory, who is the glory of the humble, and the life and salvation of his people, he who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit forever and ever. Amen. And yes, I think that's, again, just a beautiful summary of everything you've been saying. So as this pertains to Austria, you're about to talk about the various other monarchies, because of course the eldest daughter of the church during this time, of course, the great competitor to the Habsburg Imperium is France. So do you want to give us an introduction to Christian kingship in general?
Indeed, because of course, as I say, the Imperium was seen as being at the apex of the family of Christian monarchies, but each of them had a particular place, a particular position. France, of course, as you say, was called the oldest daughter of the church, and it's interesting to note that Charlemagne was considered both the first Holy Roman Emperor and the first King of France.
Yes.
And so from the very beginning, there was an odd, sometimes symbiotic, sometimes oppositional relationship between the two, between France and whomever held the imperial throne. Very often, French scholars and writers in the Middle Ages would maintain that France was not really part of the empire, but that's sort of belied by the fact that Francis I ran against Charles V in the election of 1517. The other contender, by the way, being your own Henry VIII.
Yes, and we all know what happened to Henry VIII.
Well, indeed. But the thing that's interesting there, too, is that when he broke with Rome, he also felt the need to officially declare independence for the empire. Not well known, but true. Anyhow, so the thing was that Christian monarchy, Catholic monarchy in this sense, number one, saw kingship as being, as I say, a sacrificial kind of leadership, quasi-priestly. And that's shown by the facts that country after country, the coronation robes were modeled on those of the priest. That's even true, by the way, in Britain today, with sort of cope and stole and all that.
Yeah.
The coronation was seen as being so important, so holy. It's called an eighth sacrament, in a certain sense, by a lot of writers, because with it, mediated through the church, authority was bestowed on the king by God. Now, again, we moderns like to think, oh, that meant divine right of kings. This is terrible. It means that he had complete control, and it was awful. It was awful. Well, stifling the temptation to say, go put on your mask and socially distance and get back to me when you're free. I'm not going to say that. That would be unkind. What I will say is that, again, that sacredness is something we're not used to associating with leadership. But the major feasts of the church year were a big part of the royal year. The washing of the feet on Maundy Thursday, which was a universal custom in Christian monarchies, symbolized the idea that at the Last Supper, Christ had merged the Davidic kingship with the communio of the church, and the Christian kings, to the degree that they were doing their job, partook of Christ's kingship rather than simply being rulers on their own. But of course, this gave them a ton of obligations as well. It meant they had to defend their peoples, maintain their laws, everything you saw in the Primates' prayer. The interesting thing, too, was that for certain kings, they were considered to have quasi-miraculous powers.
Yep.
So the kings of France and England, for instance, were believed to be able to cure scrofula. The kings of Castile, later Spain, were believed to have the ability to exorcise demons.
Yeah.
And the kings of Denmark to cure epilepsy, believe it or not. So the idea then is that the three great roles of the king were demi-priestly, the chief warrior and defender of his realm, and the chief judge, the font of justice. And that was the third of the king's major roles, was to ensure that justice be done to his subjects. You've heard the phrase, I'm sure, we have it in America, keeping the peace, the justice of the peace, bound over to keep the peace. Well, the peace they're referring to was not just expression, it was the king's peace. And the idea was that the king was, again, not the font of justice, the defender of his realm, a demi-priestly figure, and lastly but not leastly, the father of his people. And that's why in Catholic monarchies, the least subject could, at least in theory, approach the king with his problems. Franz Joseph, twice a week, the penultimate emperor of Austria, twice a week he had audiences in Hofburg or Schönbrunn, where if you applied, you got 2 or 3 minutes of his time. And people did it one after the other, after the other, after the other. They'd send a report of what their problems was. He'd agree to see them. They'd present the problems in person. He'd make a decision, and off they'd go. Similarly, people very often ran into such monarchs in the gardens of their palaces, which were often open to the public. Famous story about one of the leaders of the Vendée in the counter-revolution in France. I forget which one, but he was a peasant, and he had been a salt smuggler before the revolution. Well, the thing was that the man got caught, and he was sentenced to death. This is about 1785, 1786. So his mother, she was a widow, and he was her only son. She went all the way to Versailles, and she literally buttonholed Louis XVI in his garden and explained the situation. I'm a widow. He's my only support. I beg you to spare his life. So Louis XVI pardoned him. She goes back, pardon in hand, gets her son out of prison. A few years later, the War of the Vendée breaks out. He's recruited, and someone says to him, well, you know, the chance of our winning is highly unlikely. You'll probably get killed. And his response was, I owe my life to my king. If it's taken in his service, I've lost nothing. Very different point of view from what we have.
Yes, that's to understate it quite dramatically. But getting to Austria, if we may, I mean, obviously you'll be able to elaborate, to a far greater extent than I would. But the motto of Frederick III, the first Holy Roman Emperor, obviously the first king of the Romans was Rudolph of Austria back in 1272. But in the middle of the 15th century, Frederick III becomes Holy Roman Emperor, and he adopts the motto AEIOU, which has many different translations, but the most sort of commonly understood translation is Austriae est imperiare orbi universo, which means basically all the world is subject to Austria. So what I really sort of see in Austria, beginning, as you mentioned, from the inception of this imperial idea, then we have the continuity of the imperial idea in the West, beginning with Charlemagne, is that Austria and the House of Habsburg is able to carry and preserve this imperial idea all the way up until the reign of Charles. So briefly, would you like to explain how Austria isn't just a monarchy among monarchies, it is a principal monarchy, if not a universal monarchy?
Well, it had the Empire of Austria per se had its origin basically through the attempt of Emperor Francis II to avoid having Napoleon steal the title for himself. So in 1804, the year that Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French, Francis, who was still Holy Roman Emperor, created the Empire of Austria. And for 2 years, he was both Holy Roman Emperor, Emperor of Austria. In 1806, he abdicated the throne of he abdicated the imperial throne of the Holy Roman Empire and declared the empire dissolved. Now, in law, that was a bit iffy because you can abdicate a throne, but it's ultra vires to abolish the realm. And it's interesting that your king George III, as Elector of Hanover, protested the dissolution.
Yeah,
which is so. There are a lot of these scholars who will maintain that the Holy Roman Empire, in a sense, survives as a kind of disembodied spirit.
Yes, I mean, just to elaborate on your point, obviously you mentioned the fact that George III was also the Elector of Hanover. Of course, Hanover had been occupied by the French at this point, and all of the other principalities in Germany had been amalgamated into this new confederation, the Confederation of the Rhine. But of course, George was immune from this in the sense that he, of course, operated his kingdom from London at this point. So he was in a privileged position to be able to resist the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire.
Precisely right. And he did so. Unfortunately, at the Congress of Vienna, it was decided by Metternich that it would be unwise to try to revive the Holy Roman Empire. And so they settled for what was called the Germanic Confederation. Nevertheless, a lot of the symbols and trappings of the Holy Roman Empire stayed with the House of Habsburg. Their empire was unlike the Holy Roman Empire, which was nominally elected by that time. The Austrian Empire was strictly hereditary, but nevertheless, in a lot of ways, the Austrian Emperor continued to function as the Holy Roman Emperor did. So, to give two examples, he maintained an interest in Palestine and the well-being of the Eastern Christians. One of the concrete remnants of that today is the Austrian Hospice in Jerusalem. By the same token, the Congress of Vienna left the Emperor of Austria as the guarantor of both the Italian and the German status quo.
Yep.
And that would remain unchallenged in Italy until the main line of the House of Savoy died out in 1831, at which point a junior branch took over, which was much more liberal. And they initiated what became the Risorgimento in Italy.
Mm.
But all through that, the Austrians felt a responsibility to maintain the Papal States and so forth. In Germany, apart from 1848 and so forth, it would have to wait until the death of Frederick William IV, who was King of Prussia, the Romantic on the throne, and in a sense pro-Austrian, until his older brother became King of Prussia. There was little trouble for the Habsburgs at that point. But alas and alack, you had both the German and Italian reunifications, which left Franz Joseph, the Habsburgs, and Austria-Hungary relatively isolated.
Yes, and there's one point I want to mention. You said that the Austrian emperor was the protector of Palestine, and of many of the Christians in Eastern Christendom at this point. Would you like to explain how the Holy Roman Emperors and then the Emperors of Austria achieved this title of King of Jerusalem?
Well, it actually goes back, believe it or not, to Frederick II, who, as we know, had the Hohenstaufen in the 1200s had certain problems with the Holy See, stupor mundi, as they called him. Nevertheless, he went on crusade, even though he was excommunicated, and managed to regain Jerusalem and part of the Holy Land. And he took the title of King of Jerusalem. Now, from there, it came eventually to the Habsburgs. But it's interesting to note that there are various other European monarchs who, for various other reasons, also claimed it. The kings of Spain, the kings of Naples, the Emperor of Russia. There are a number of candidates for the throne as far as Jerusalem is concerned. And the other thing, too, is that France, who was always the great rival of the Habsburgs, were their rivals here, too. They were allied to Turkey, which against the Habsburgs often enough. And so that allowed them to, in a much more definite way, to ensure the security of the Christians in the Holy Land. But Austrian interest did not flag, and it's also interesting to note that both the Catholic Coptic Church in Egypt, that is to say the Catholic Church of the Coptic Rite, and the Catholic missions in southern Sudan all operated with Austrian protection. The other thing to note is that the Holy Roman Emperor, after the Reformation, was responsible for the defense of what Catholics there were in northern Germany and in Scandinavia. When the Holy Roman Empire ended, this was a job the emperors of Austria took up. So when you, I don't know if it's still there, but the Catholic Cathedral, St. Ansgar's in Copenhagen, until a few years ago, had a big double eagle because it was financed by Franz Joseph.
Wonderful. So, getting us on to Karl and just the chronology, getting us there. You've elucidated how the empire was shut out of Italy thanks to the Risorgimento, and it was shut out of Germany due to German unification, and how in a relatively short amount of time, and we're talking from 1859 until 1866, and then definitively in 1871, Austria had been reduced from, again, you can say the hegemon of the German principalities and the Italian states, and of course the protector of the Pope. And by 1871, it had been reduced to this new function. And again, the post-Ausgleich empires, of course, we create the Hungarian aspect of the empire too. So it's not just Austria, it is Austria-Hungary. And the lands are divided into the lands represented in the Imperial Council, or Cisleitania, and the lands of the Crown of St. Stephen, i.e. Transleitania. So Could you explain briefly, what the impact of this is and how this affects the running of the empire going forward throughout the rest of the reign of Franz Joseph?
Well, several things. One is that, and this is a very, very important thing to understand, in 1848, when you had revolts all over the empire, they came very close to collapsing. You had a revolution in Hungary, led by a gentleman called Louis Kossuth. And the Hungarian Revolution was put down with the aid of the Hungarian subject peoples, the Slovaks, Croats, Romanian, Transylvanian Romanians, Serbs, and so forth, and the Russians, who intervened. Well, in 1853, Britain and France go to war, Turkey go to war with Russia. The Russians turn around and ask Franz Joseph to come to their aid. Now, he didn't. He declared neutrality. And this would bear unpleasant fruit later, because when he needed allies, he didn't have them. Which brings us to the question of the Ausgleich. Because the settlement with Hungary was fraught with difficulty, in some ways not unlike the settlement with our American South after our Second Civil War in the 1860s. How do I put it? The revolutionary element was still present. It is, of course, important to remember that there was also a very large loyalist element in Hungary. It was not all revolutionary by any stretch. But the party that became dominant in Hungary was the Liberal Party, which was headed by a series of members of a family called Tisza. Now, unfortunately, the Ausgleich ended up having the byproduct of the subject peoples who had been loyal to the dynasty in 1848 basically being handed over to the heirs of their enemies. There are a lot of ironies involved here. Part of the price of unity and peace was allowing the Hungarian revolutionaries to honor their quote-unquote heroes, statues of Kossuth and all that kind of thing. Again, reminiscent of what the United States went through after our Civil War.
And of course, Kossuth, I believe he went over to the United States and was petitioning for Hungarian independence there. I don't think he ever became reconciled to the idea of Ausgleich, but many former revolutionaries, such as Andrássy, did, and indeed during the 1870s became the foreign minister of both Austria and Hungary. And it's not just the fact that you mentioned that the Slovaks, the Romanians, the Croats, and the Ruthenians as well, and of course Germans. There is a substantial German population within the Hungarian part of the empire as well. Not only do they come under the control of this Hungarian elite, this Liberal Party, but the Liberal Party within Austria also has a very restricted franchise. So the Hungarian magnates remain dominant in this part of the empire. And also they pursue a policy of Magyarization, whereby they essentially compel their subjects to speak Hungarian within the Hungarian half of the empire.
Yeah, and that would have all sorts of unpleasantries later on. In the Austrian half of the empire, which included Galicia and Bohemia, Moravia, Dalmatia, it was easier in some ways, in the sense that there was no attempt to Germanize any of these peoples, but there were a lot of ethnic rivalries.
Yeah.
In Galicia, you had the Poles and the Ruthenians. In Bohemia, you had the Sudeten Germans and the Czechs. It just went on and on and on. And the irony there is that the franchise, progressively through the 19th century, became ever wider and wider. But the wider it became, the more divided Parliament became.
Yeah.
And the more difficult to administer things. It was so much so that in 1905, our former, as it was then, former President Teddy Roosevelt, came to Vienna and asked Franz Josef what he thought the role of a modern monarch was. And his response was, it was utterly perfect, but if you know the context, you can see it was won by hard experience. Protecting my people from their politicians.
Yes, it's a wonderful quote. It's one of my favorite quotes of all time, and yes, I mean it basically exemplifies everything. I mean, Franz Josef was, the king of compromise in the sense he was always tweaking around with the constitution, trying to create a situation that ensures some sort of peace and stability within the empire, even though democratic government as we know it was definitely not the case, even though by 1906 in the Austrian half of the empire, the franchise would basically become universal. All the minister presidents and all the ministers were ultimately dependent on the emperor for support. And, the political factions that did exist were, fractious, where, for example, the Social Democrats became one of the largest parties in the empire by 1906. Within, I mean, you talked about the ethnic conflicts within the empire, of course. Within the Galicia-Lodomeria, we have the Ruthenians versus the Poles. Within Bohemia and Moravia, of course, we have the Germans, and against the Germans versus the Czechs. And just getting to 1887, and when Charles becomes a relevant political figure. Of course, you mentioned the fact that the empire didn't try and Germanify the Austrian part of the empire. Well, again, the assumption being that because the Austrians were Germans, therefore it was a German empire. Of course, that wasn't true either. In fact, the pan-Germanists were some of the staunchest opponents of the Habsburg royal family. And as you mentioned in your book, quite succinctly, they were naturally allies with the more independently minded Hungarians as well. And so, throughout the 1880s in particular, with von Taffer, we have a coalition made up of actually anti-pan-Germanists. And in response, of course, we have the Linz program. So I think well, hopefully, for the viewers, that has elucidated the run up really to Charles and where he enters the historical picture. I think there's one event in particular, we should discuss, which is the Imperial Succession, because of course Franz Josef had a son, Crown Prince Rudolf. Just also for context, Franz Josef had his wife Empress Sisi was. Again, one of the most interesting but tumultuous marriages in the 19th century. I think it's fair to say she would meet a tragic death at the hands of an Italian anarchist just before the turn of the century. But Rudolf died under scandalous circumstances in 1889 in what is known to history as the Meierling affair. Where would you like to explain what's happened there? Because again, I'm actually sort of related to the Betsera family, so I have some sort of connection to this. But
well, of course, actually, this is something I wish had never happened, and hate to explain it, but I will. Well, basically, Rudolf was a difficult child, as you might say. His mother and his father were very fond of each other, but his mother was a free spirit, as it were. She's been compared, in a sense, to Princess Diana, and that's not entirely wrong. It's not entirely correct either, but one can see why one would think that. Rudolf, as he grew up, became somewhat estranged from his father. I say somewhat because he and his father continued to enjoy going hunting together, which was sort of interesting. And in fact, they went hunting together not too long before he died. And this was seen as a reconciliation of sorts. Anyway, he married a Belgian princess. He lost interest. He met your kinswoman, who was considerably younger than he. They began an affair, and then came their deaths. Now, I cannot emphasize enough that the affair at Meierling was the Kennedy assassination of the 19th century. It's the best way I can describe it. There are all sorts of explanations as to what happened. The story that Franz Josef, in the end, sponsored was that in a fit of madness, he killed himself and the Baroness. But there are other possible explanations. The Empress Zina always thought that it was a murder. She had reasons for thinking so. I myself have heard from some of the monks at Heiligenkreuz Abbey, which received the bodies immediately, that the fingers of the Crown Prince were broken. Now, obviously, if his fingers were broken, there was no way he could have pulled the trigger.
Yes.
It's very difficult. So, I doubt. I mean, you would have to reopen the sarcophagus and look, and I highly doubt that's going to happen, because the can of worms that would open, if you'll pardon the expression, given that it's a sarcophagus, would be huge. If it should turn out that the fingers are not broken, well, then it's a bad story, the suicide, etc. But if they are, if it was a murder, all kinds of unpleasant possibilities open up. Zina was of the opinion that the then rather Republican Masonic government of France had a hand in it. The idea is that it had been thought that Rudolph could be gotten to declare against his father. The famous reconciliation hunting trip ended that hope, and so it was decided to stuff him. I don't know. I don't claim to know. It's, again, as with the Kennedy assassination, you'd only know if you were part of it. I'm not, so I don't. But it had the concrete result of altering the succession, because now it was Franz Josef's brother who was the heir to the throne. And more specifically, given his age, he had two sons, Franz Ferdinand and Otto. Franz Ferdinand was a very, very pious individual, a great hunter, very, shall we say, deeply committed to whatever he wanted to do. His younger brother was very different. He wasn't really pious at all. Great ladies' man, very charming, perhaps a bit shallow. He got married to a Saxon princess. They were not very well suited, but they did have two sons, the older of whom was Karl. Franz Ferdinand, he marries, but he falls in love with a Countess Kotek, Sophie Countess Kotek, who, wonderful lady, but not of royal stature. So, big fight in the family. Eventually, Franz Ferdinand gets his way, but the marriage is morganatic, and so none of Franz Ferdinand's and Sophie's children can inherit the throne.
Yes, and just for reference, obviously, morganatic marriage is a marriage between two unequal pairs, because the Habsburg family in particular, especially Franz Josef, was very concerned about the idea of the diminution of the royal bloodline, because, the prestige of the monarchy had been, drained away so much throughout the 19th century that ensuring the integrity of the House of Habsburg was something that he himself could control. And so in 1900, it wasn't just, a morganatic marriage. He had to swear an oath that his children would not inherit. His wife could not attend alongside her husband at official functions, at dinners, being the same carriage as him, in terms of how, again, strictness. Even when she gets assassinated in Sarajevo, she is not allowed to be buried alongside her husband, again due to the difference in status between them. But again, the significance of this is that sorry.
Well, there's one point I have to make. Actually, they are buried together, but not at the Kaisergruft. You see, Franz Ferdinand, in order to avoid that very problem, decreed that he and his wife would be interred in his home, Schloss Arnstedt, which is a very nice place. We're seeing it's still in the hands of their children today, their descendants, the Hornbergs. But you're quite right, though, as far as the rest of it goes. And one of the reasons why Franz Ferdinand and his wife enjoyed going on private tours to England and elsewhere was because none of those issues came up. But here is a fascinating insight to me on Franz Ferdinand's character. His nephew is going to inherit, not his children. As you say, he had to swear an oath that they're not in line. And yet, you can imagine a lot of people feeling a terrible resentment to the nephew, couldn't you? Not a bit of it. Not a bit of it. He was in many ways a surrogate father to Charles. And that's why one of the things I learned in writing this book was how much a part of Charles's formation and outlook Franz Ferdinand was.
Yes, and that really comes across in your book. I mean, I've got some images up here. One, of course, is Karl Ludwig, who was the younger brother of Franz Joseph, who was, again, the progenitor of both Franz Ferdinand and Otto Franz. Otto Franz dies in 1906, a very young age, in his 40s. And this, in 1906, propels, the very young Otto, who's only, I think, 18 or 19 at this point, to the position of being heir to the throne and likely to inherit, because Franz Ferdinand is in middle age. But Franz Ferdinand had many ideas for the reform of the empire. I mean, one of the particular ideas he had was for a federalization of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, diminishing the power of the Hungarian part of the empire significantly, in particular allying with the Romanians against the Hungarians. And again, this even featured into his foreign policy strategy, which involved an alliance with Romania in addition to the Romanians within the empire. I think as you go into discussing Charles's own political program when we get to post-1916, is how this aspiration for federalism, again, really informs his character, but also his personal piety. So yes, I think your claim here that the two were again dependent on each other, and again the young heir had again this almost sort of father-son relationship with him is very, very much borne out, especially in his political program, especially, and again concerning his faith as well. So yes, I think that's a very important point to establish.
And he also gave his nephew in the example that he set with his wife Sophie of a happy marriage, which was not something he had that much connection with. His own parents were not happily married. Franz Joseph and Sisi we've spoken about. But in the midst of all of that, here's Franz Ferdinand and Sophie living a very, other than the occasional morganatic ceremonial snubs, they're living a very happy domestic life. He grows up seeing their children born, seeing the way a family should function. And that, of course, will have a direct bearing on his own married life and what he's looking for in a wife. But at any rate, the other thing, too, that's fascinating about Franz Ferdinand, and it does bear remembering, he's often characterized as being anti-Magyar. That's not really true. He was anti-Tisa.
Yeah.
He was anti-liberal. He was anti-Magyarization. But the proof of the pudding is that he, when he was stationed in Győr, Western Hungary, he would walk through the streets without any security. The locals loved him, and he got as a Hungarian tutor, a Father Joseph Lányi, who plays a very important part in his story in a weird way later on. But when his children began to be born, because the court bishop had been very much opposed to his marriage, he had Father Lagny baptize all his children, which was a direct slap in the face to the court bishop and to the opponents of the marriage. But I mention it because he was very close to the Zicsis. He was very close to the Hungarian Catholic Party. And that's important to remember. So I say it again. He was not anti-Magyar. He was in favor of the Magyars assuming their place amongst the other nationalities.
Yes. Yes, I think it's important to emphasize that being anti the Ausgleich or pro-reform of the Hungarian settlement didn't make you necessarily anti-Hungarian, but anti a certain group, as you've elucidated, which is this liberal collection of elite magnates invariably under the Tisza family, of which produced 2 minister presidents. The Tisza, of course, being a river in eastern Hungary as well. So just about the formative experience of Charles, of course, his father was a soldier. And this meant that the young Charles was speeded around quite a few military encampments, especially in Prague as well. And by 1906, he had become a career officer in Prague. And in addition to, as you elucidated in your book, attending a public gymnasium and being educated in law and history in the sciences, and making quite a positive impression, being a very popular character. And then we get to, one of the most significant aspects of his early life, again, the most significant aspect of his early life, which is his marriage to Zita of Bourbon-Parma. And this, from the angle in comparison to the Sophie Chotek marriage, had the wonderful factor of being, especially for Franz Josef, a love match between two equally compatible, members of royal families, which meant that the succession was secure, and that again the Habsburg establishment was completely happy with the marriage, and that the dynasty would continue through Charles. Would you like to elaborate on? Because again, they did love each other, and Zita was almost perpetually pregnant. She produced 8 children in 11 years, I believe.
Yeah, it's true. And she was a fascinating woman all in herself. Firstly, her father was the last Duke of Parma, the last Bourbon Duke of Parma. He'd been driven out by the Risorgimento. But what this meant concretely was that her family were very, very close to the Comte de Chambord, the last legitimate French prince, Henri V, who was living until he died in 1885 in Frosdorf, which is not too far from here in Niederösterreich. They were close to the Carlist kings of Spain, both in terms of descent, and they lived not too far from them, and they knew them. In fact, one of the Carlists was interested in her, and when Karl heard that the Carlist Bourbon prince had proposed to her, and then was assured it hadn't happened yet, he said, "Well, I better do it before he does."
Absolutely, so, and there's a wonderful segment where again you were telling it from Zita's story in your book as well, how this was a major prompting for Charles, who had met her, I believe, again in 1909, and they become fast friends. And again, as you mentioned, she had a powerful personality, and they were both also, devout Catholics, which is an important point to emphasize. And just for reference, you mentioned Henri V, Comte de Chambord, Henri V. I did another stream retelling the story of the legitimacy in France. He had been offered the throne, of course, in 1873, due to many other issues involving, principally the flag. He had refused to be accepted in France, and of course, France had, throughout the remainder of the 20th century, gone down the steady path towards secularization and republicanism, away from the prospect of monarchy in the 1870s. So, yes, I think it's remarkable that again we have these families all sort of again living in exile. One of the tragedies of Zita is that you mentioned the Carlists, and of course another Bourbon, but of the branch of Isabella, Alfonso XIII, as King of Spain at this point. The Bourbons at this point have been, or that branch of the Bourbons have been kicked out of Spain. They've been kicked out of Italy and kicked out of France. And of course, when we get to the final exile of Zita, she references, I think, to the British liaison officer what can I call my home after all this? Again, a tragedy of the family is not just the Habsburgs losing all their throne; it's also the House of Bourbon.
It is, and as a sort of icing on the cake, in a sense, her mother was the daughter of Don Miguel, who was the conservative king of Portugal, who was defeated in the Civil War there. So she was, in a very real sense, she was heiress to the all the traditions of Western European Catholic monarchy. The Bourbon, the Bourbon, and the Braganza. So she marries Charles, who is the heir to the Habsburgs. There have been this is perhaps the third Habsburg Bourbon marriage that was really significant. The first being Anne of Austria and Louis XIII. The second being Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. And the third being Charles and Zita. But after they married, Charles said to his new wife, "Now we must help each other get to heaven."
Yes.
And this is very, very important to understand, because for them both, marriage was a holy vocation. Now, why is this important? Because they had the idea of vocation. It wasn't only marriage, it was also kingship. That too was a vocation. One of the things I should mention about Charles, we all of us in life today go through various rituals and ceremonies, which most of us take for granted.
Yes.
Whether you're taking an oath to go to the army or going through your graduation from school or whatever it is, we go through these rituals. From an early age, Charles had to go through quite a few of them, would not do them pro forma. So, for instance, when he was brought into the Order of the Golden Fleece, he insisted, with the help of his French tutor, in deciphering the rather arcane Old French of the rules, the statutes of the Order of the Golden Fleece, to ensure that he could swear the oath honestly.
Yeah.
Well, later on, it would be the same way with the coronation, and it was the same way with his marriage. Pro forma was not Emperor Charles. With him, it had to be real. And that's a trait that you see in almost everything he did. He took, for instance, I'll give you another example that came to me working on his story. He, as I say, came from a very, very difficult background. Well, in a very real sense, he is sort of a patron for those who come from broken homes or difficult families, because while he stayed on very good terms with both of his parents, he loved them both, but he also got the best traits of each. He got his mother's piety and deep devotion and deep seriousness of purpose without any of her dour manner. And he got his father's charm and humor and easy manner without the promiscuity or the shallowness. So this would actually stand him in very good stead later, because despite the political and personal problems between Franz Joseph and Franz Ferdinand, he managed to stay on good terms with both of them. And even though politically he agreed with his uncle, he very much understood his great uncle and why he did things the way he did. This is a marvelous example for people from difficult backgrounds to follow.
And just for reference, when you're talking about the circle, you're talking about the Belvedere Circle,
yes,
the alternative court set up by Franz Ferdinand in the Belvedere Palace in Vienna. So yes, this gets us on to where everything becomes unmistakably tragic, which is the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in 1914. Again, just because this can very much drag into a conversation about the origins of World War One, which on this channel and on other channels I've gone into to death, and it's not really that relevant for this discussion on Charles. But just to emphasize that Franz Ferdinand is visiting Sarajevo with his wife, Countess Chiritek, in what is basically a private affair, not a state affair, hence why she's allowed to be in the car with him. And tragically, this results in Gavrilo Princip, who was one of the members of an organization known as the Black Hand Gang, which had support from the Serbian Interior Ministry, assassinating him in Sarajevo. This was the successful assassination attempt. There had been quite a few others on that day. This was the 28th of June, 1914. And the effect of this is, of course, is that Karl is now the heir presumptive, and the emperor, of course, being very old at this point, the emperor is now 84. And among other things, this begins, the cascade of events that would lead to Austria declaring war on Serbia, Germany declaring war on Russia, and ultimately Russia declaring war on Austria-Hungary much later on. And here we get to the Soldier King, Charles I, as a warrior who actually spent time on the front, as opposed to many of the other heads of state during this time. There are exceptions such as Vittorio Emanuele III of Italy, but as far as I'm aware, he spent time on the Italian front, and in fact commanding troops. There was a junior commander of the Edelweiss Corps, and being quite successful in that department, and of course commanding troops on the Galician front and on the Romanian front as well, because we have the Brusilov offensive in 1916, and we have the Romanian offensive in 1916 when the Romanians enter the war just after the Brusilov offensive. Just to get people up to speed, the Austrians do rather poorly during the war, but ultimately are able to hold on. To everyone's surprise, the army is able to keep replenishing its numbers and keep fighting on for 4 years. During the beginning of the war in 1914, the Germans inflict a massive victory against the Russians at Tannenberg, but the Austrians are defeated in Galicia-Lodomeria, and most of Galicia-Lodomeria is occupied by Russians for about 9 months, until the Austrians, with German help, reclaim this territory. In 1915, the Italians, having been the erstwhile allies of the Austrians and the Germans, of course, they defect, and they, in return for the Treaty of London, which gives them the Trentino, the Austrian littoral, Dalmatia, all provinces, of the Italian irredentists, with, especially in Dalmatia, very few Italians, but definitely a marked Italian cultural influence due to the presence of the Venetians there, brings Italy onto the war, and they're expecting a easy pass to Trieste. And of course, this doesn't happen, and there is a horrific front in the Alps called the White Hell. And this is the situation into which Charles will later become emperor. So just before we get to his coronation, would you like to tell us a bit about his experiences during the war?
Well, certainly. It was interesting that before the war, his uncle was very keen on getting rid of the chief of staff, Konrad von Hötzendorf.
Yes.
And the commander, their cousin, Archduke Albrecht, the Duke of Teschen, whom he did not consider to be competent. He died before he could push any further on that, but it was very much a problem. And Karl, as we will see, Karl shared their views, his uncle's views. But when the war broke out, his great uncle, the Kaiser, put him in several different positions, because on the one hand, as you rightly point out, he had various command positions, but in between, his great uncle had him run backwards and forwards to the various fronts to see for himself what was going on and to report back. This had a big influence on him because he was right there. You mentioned the White Hell. On one occasion, there was a we call it gully washer back home, but a flash flood because of melting snow, and a somewhat lame soldier who'd been invalided out of the front and was watching the horses, basically. He was swept away in the torrent, and then Archduke Charles jumped in after him and rescued him at great risk to his own life. This kind of thing was not lost on the men. But he had a great, on the one hand, he had a great belief in getting the mission achieved, but on the other, he believed in limiting slaughter as much as possible. He was also very keen that POWs should be treated well, and that damage to civilians be limited as much as possible. These were not things that were foremost in the minds of a lot of military leaders during World War I. So, as a result, of what he saw, he had been against the war from the beginning. But of course, he wasn't in a position to do anything about it. He told his wife when the war broke out, the problem of being allied with Germany is that it's like being a clay pot tied up to an iron one.
Yeah.
Will break. So he believed that Austria's survival was dependent upon both withdrawal from the conflict as soon as possible and federalization. The problem he faced was that it was difficult to do the one without the other. So he even then he began to form his own opinion about the Continental War, which he would really only be able to voice when he became emperor. But let's put it this way. You know your own Bonnie Prince Charlie in 1746, when the Jacobites had come all the way down from Scotland to Derby, he was keen on going all the way to London. And in fact, the Elector of Hanover, as they called him, was packing to leave. But he was overruled by his lieutenants, who said, "Oh, no, the English haven't risen for you. We better go back to Scotland and regroup." Well, Bonnie Prince Charlie knew that was a very bad idea. It didn't matter. He was overruled, and back they went, with the result being Culloden and the ruin of the cause. Well, throughout his career, as his relatively short career as ruler, he had a very similar feeling, in the sense that he didn't know what needed to be done. It's just everybody else who were older and wiser, quote unquote, thought they knew better, and they didn't. Part of the reason for this, I think, was his experiences on the front.
Yes. I think you mentioned something key here, which is how savvy he was in being able to detect that Austria's interests lay from detaching its alliance with Germany. And of course, the German alliance had occurred in 1879 after Bismarck had reorientated his foreign policy away from the Kulturkampf and towards, again, more isolation of France, which involved taking Austria back and preventing an alliance between Austria and France. By 1914, you mentioned again Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand, of course, was skeptical of the German alliance, wanted to exert independence as much as possible of Austria-Hungary from German influence, despite being a close personal friend of the Kaiser. In fact, they were on a hunting trip just shortly before the assassination. And this is really where we get to the very brief and the very tragic reign, because, of course, he is recalled from the front line in October of 1916, just a month before Franz Josef dies, and he'll die in November of 1916. And after the funeral, he rushes over to, first of all, I think important to note, he assumes direct control of the army and therefore direct responsibility for the course of the war. And then on the 30th of December, he is crowned King of Hungary. And a question I want to put to you, because you put it very succinctly in your book, is a lot of historians give him flack for his lack of foresight in confirming essentially the legal settlement of the Ausgleich through the coronation oath, which involved, among other things, defending the inviolability of the Hungarian territorial settlement, i.e. Transleithania and the Crowns of St. Stephen, and therefore allowing that Hungarian elite to Magyarize the various populations within the kingdom. However, you contend that while he took the coronation oath as King of Hungary incredibly seriously, he also believed it applied equally to the non-Magyar peoples as much as the Hungarians themselves. And therefore, it was his commitment to protect them. And therefore, whilst he agreed with the actual legal document, which he signed before his coronation, he was very intent on reforming the situation with Hungary, regardless.
Well, definitely. I mean, he was all too aware that, in a real sense, the Slovaks, Transylvanian Romanians, Croats, etc., who had rallied to the dynasty in 1848, they were really fighting for the Kingdom of Hungary, not Kossuth. They were upholding the Holy Crown, not Kossuth, not the Tisas. The other thing, though, was that Tisza did, for reasons of his own, believing that being crowned King of Hungary would force Charles to accept the status quo and not be able to question it. He basically threatened him and said, well, if you're not crowned king and don't take the oath, then you're not King of Hungary, and we'll do what we like. And amongst other things, that would have meant, as they in the end did do, that would have meant cutting off grain to the Austrian half of the empire.
Yes.
So, it's easy for folks sitting in their armchairs to criticize a man in his position for not having foresight. Well, again, I think the period of time we're living in right now is particularly useful for those sorts of objections.
And I think that, again, that's a clear point you make. Again, it's recognizing the fraught political situation he's in. I think, again, in terms of the overarching political legacy of this, probably, again, the most stumbling aspect of this, which is the result of defending the inviolability of the territories. You have in your background, I've noticed, a variation of the Croatian flag. And of course, Karl is a advocate of trialism. He's not particularly keen on one of the trialistic proposals, which is the creation of an enlarged Poland with himself as king. In fact, he tries to detach Galicia, Lodomeria, and many of his peace proposals, and ultimately in his Imperial Manifesto in October of 1918. However, the Croatians had time and time again proven themselves as being one of the most loyal of the constituent peoples of the empire. And Croatia also had the oddity in the fact it was separated over three of the territorial units in the empire. It wasn't just Austria and Hungary. There was also Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was a condominium of basically an extension of the finance ministry, because it was neither part of Austria or Hungary. And so the Croatians within the empire were divided among, but first of all, we have the Dalmatians were part of Austria, Croatia, Slavonia was part of Hungary, and the Croatians in Bosnia and Herzegovina were part of the co-dominion. So towards the end of his reign, we're talking October of 1918, it could have, again, shored up his position potentially to unite all of these entities into a Croatian kingdom, basically with the status of Hungary. And because of the Hungarian, the oath of inviolability and Hungary having a veto over this, the Hungarians veto such a project in October, which, again, you can say precipitates the collapse of Croatia, and they're breaking away and eventually declaring independence from Karl. I think in terms of the long-term effects, you can say that is the most direct negative effect of agreeing with the situation in Hungary.
Well, and certainly, what was interesting was that Croatia, Slavonia, was a separate kingdom allied to Hungary, the way Hungary was allied to Austria.
Yes.
But under the Tisas, of course, they chiseled away at their liberties as much as they could.
Yes.
In the end, just a few days before everything fell apart, at the very end of October, Karl was able to convince the Hungarian government to allow it. And so for a few short days, the Kingdom of Croatia existed. It's interesting that the decree declaring its existence was destroyed, the physical copies, was destroyed by as many, is destroyed by the new Yugoslav authorities in as many places as they could find it. A copy of it was recently discovered in the past few years by a Croatian researcher. You'll never guess where he found it. The one place the Yugoslavs never thought to look. Found it in the archives in Sarajevo. So
no, that's wonderful. And again, I'm sure, and again, just emphasizing how all of these little things could have been so different had there not been so many people sadly willing to betray Karl. And I think that this moves on to you can say the great project of his reign, which he's known as the Peace Emperor. And if it's possible, I would like to discuss the Sixtus affair. So is it possible to give a broad overview of what the Sixtus affair is and what the impact of it was?
Well, it's a little bit complicated, but basically, two of Zita's brothers, Sixtus and Xavier Bourbon Parma, were refused entry into the French army because they were Bourbon. So they joined the Belgian army instead, and they fought against the Germans. Well, when Charles became king and of Hungary, Emperor of Austria, he immediately started to brainstorm about peace. One of the ways to do this was to establish a clear venue to the Allies. But how do you do that? Well, his brothers-in-law. That's how. Now, one of the individuals who were in on it, if you will, was King Albert of the Belgians, who gave the brothers permission to go to Switzerland and then Austria. But he, they called him the Night King for a reason. And even though he knew what was going on, he kept his mouth shut. So, through his brothers-in-law, Charles opened up negotiations with Poincaré, who was the French. He started out as the French president. I guess he was premier by this time. I forgot. Anyway, so they opened up negotiations with the French. Now, the French consulted Lloyd George. However, one of the problems was this Treaty of London you mentioned earlier. It was a secret treaty, so they were bound not to reveal it to Karl. And yet, they couldn't very well agree to anything that would violate that secret treaty. And this is just one of the many weird elements that were involved. But Karl agreed that Alsace-Lorraine should go back to France. And by the way, this was a view he had long before the war, because he'd been there. He thought, well, they're French, they belong as part of France. The reconstitution of Belgium, the reconstitution of Serbia, he agreed with all of that. Now, he had notified the Kaiser of Germany that he was going through negotiations through third parties. Would not tell him who, and explain why when the Kaiser declared himself satisfied. But at the end of the day, the whole thing broke down over the Italian question, which was never really revealed to him. Interestingly enough, the Italian commanding general, independent of his government, sent out feelers to try to negotiate directly with the Austrians because he thought Italy was about to collapse. But Karl did not want to go into that because he thought he was negotiating with the Allied political leadership and didn't want to do a deal around them. And I'm vastly oversimplifying it because the ins and outs are very complex. But suffice to say that they went nowhere because when the Allies were losing and were interested in peace, the Germans were not interested in peace. And when the Germans were winning and the Allies were interested in peace, the Germans weren't interested.
And I think the fundamental stumbling block again is that you mentioned Alsace-Lorraine and how Charles had come to the conclusion that it basically could be ceded to France. In terms of organizing this around Germany, the German High Command never accepted this idea, not for a minute. But talking to Wilhelm II, the idea put to him was that perhaps there could be some compensation of territory, such as an enlarged Poland in the east, with Galicia-Lodomeria as part of it as compensation. But nevertheless, again, especially with the mood of the German public at that time, because despite Alsace-Lorraine having been part of France from again incorporated piecemeal over time, but beginning in the 17th century, confirmed by the 18th century, and for at least 100 years before 1871, the region had been entirely French. The region had only temporarily been acquired by the Germans after the Franco-Prussian War, and the French, of course, saw it as their lost territories and an integral part of the French monarchy, and they weren't prepared to budge on this issue whatsoever. You mentioned the Italian issue. I think one of the most interesting aspects of this is that despite the military victories of the Austrians on this front, the Italians hadn't really got anywhere. If anything, the Italians were a liability in many respects to the Entente powers. Karl was still prepared to cede some small amount of territory to the Italians in order to achieve peace, namely some area of the South Tyrol, which is now known as Trentino. Nevertheless, this isn't satisfied, and of course, this whole relationship, I think, is also undermined by the fact that the Allies themselves, the Entente powers, had their own competing interests. So, for example, Lloyd George ends up, again, being, you can say, militarily incompetent in one respect. Lloyd George believed that undermining Germany's allies was more important than attacking Germany itself. So he had arranged the Gallipoli campaign with Winston Churchill, but he also wanted to knock out Austria during 1917. And so at the same time, we were having these peace feelers during the Sixes Affair. Lloyd George was trying to organize a successful, again, campaign against the Austrians in 1917. And of course, as you illustrate in the book, the Austrians actually gained one of their greatest victories in Italy shortly after, which is the victory of Caporetto. And what complicates the peace treaty even more is that we have the American entry into the war in April of 1917. The Russian Tsar had been, deposed during the Ides of March in 1917, and now we have the Kerensky government continuing the war on the Eastern Front. So within, essentially the entire sort of political map of Europe being redrawn, month by month as the war goes on. Austria is desperately trying to find some sort of settlement in the middle where, Karl especially, where Austria can retain its independence and it can find other allies. And of course, one option is to ally with the French and the Russians against the Germans. But of course, he can't unilaterally declare peace either. He can't just declare peace and say we're not at war, because that would have meant the Germans possibly invading the Austrians at the same time, because by this time they become militarily independent. So again, it's one thing saying, it was a futile endeavor engaging in peace, but again, it was fundamentally pursuing Austria's own interests and its own survival and its own independence, because again, the prospect is that had the Germans won the war, Austria would have been possibly dismembered at some future date, and due to some sort of pan-Germanic aspiration, because Austria would have been subordinated to some sort of vassal position at the same time. So German victory or no, Austria was an impossible predicament.
It really was. And of course, going back to Franz Ferdinand for a moment, he had pursued, just as he pursued a sort of independent course in internal affairs, he also pursued one in foreign affairs. He was on very friendly terms with the Russians. He went to England in 1913 to a hunting party at a great estate at which the entire leadership of the Conservative Party was present. Now, they were out of government at the time, but I cannot help but suspect that he discussed with them the possibility of an Anglo-Austrian alliance at such time as he was emperor and the Tories were back in power. And if you think about it, an alliance between Britain, Russia, and Austria would have really served to keep the peace and force the French and the Germans to relax, in a matter of speaking.
Yes, a sort of a restoration of the alliance that had existed during the Spanish War of Succession, when again France was the principal enemy, but again the French and the Germans obviously warring over the issue of Alsace-Lorraine. And again, it's one of the tragedies. I mean, you mentioned among other things, Franz Ferdinand was also one of the greatest proponents of peace alongside Karl. And one of the tragedies of his death is that it leaves the government policy-making decisions all in the hands of the war party led by Berchtold and led by von Hötzendorf,
who were well, what can I tell you? The combination of ignorance, arrogance, and incompetence, while far from unknown to us today, of course, in governing circles. Let's just say that it was the curse of death to Austria-Hungary.
Mm-hmm. And there's one figure which we haven't mentioned yet, which is Charles's foreign minister, von Czernin. And of course, in addition to being undermined by your allies, and of course, the Sixties affair would be leaked later by Clemenceau to make the situation between Germany and Austria even more tenuous, von Czernin was also invariably opposed to the emperor's peacemaking efforts and wanted, was essentially pro-German and wanted a general peace, with Germany, and wanted Austria to be subordinated to German interests. There's even an anecdote, if I recall, in your book, where he apparently sort of went off on the emperor and with a hysteric raving, and the emperor called for a police officer to take him away, and alas, that didn't happen. But so yes, he was betrayed on all fronts, even by his own ministers.
He was indeed, and again, it makes me think of Monty, Prince Charlie, and Derby. Czernin, the incident to which you refer, came about because Czernin had been going on about how Austria would always stick with Germany and would never admit the giving up of a single piece of German land. Clemenceau, who had taken over at that point, said, well, that's not entirely true, because he had access to the secret negotiations. I've heard it said that your government would be willing to give up Alsace-Lorraine. Well, Czernin denied it. Clemenceau threatened to publish it. Czernin denied it again. Clemenceau published it. Czernin demanded that the emperor basically declare that it was not true. In other words, that he'd lie. The emperor wasn't keen on doing that, and so Czernin went hysterical and came up to the palace and told him that if he didn't sign it, he would kill himself. And that's when he called the police. And he said, kid, you've got to take him away. They said, well, we can't take him away until he actually does something.
So moving on from this, again, failed attempt at peace, we get to the American entry in the war. And one of the effects of Caporetto is, of course, it gives the Americans a strategic reason to enter the war, despite, again, the fact that Austrians and Americans hadn't been engaged militarily. The Germans, of course, had been waging their unrestricted submarine warfare throughout 1917, which had the effect of bringing the Americans onto the war, among many other reasons, which were, again, not really relevant to the stream. Of course, you mention in your book that the American pretext for entering the war against Austria was so flimsy that they had to rely on a Austrian-sounding name of a submarine in order to sort of indicate that Austria had directly attacked American vessels or something along those lines.
Well, what it was that when they were being interviewed in the Senate, one of the people was asked, "Well, how do you know it was Austrian?" And they said, "Oh, well, they were speaking Austrian." So it was not. I mean, okay, I guess they were. You know, there was a very famous Austrian writer, Erich von Knettendien,
Yeah.
who he made a point which I like to point out to people repeatedly. And that is, there are two elements at work in any historical episode: conspiracy and catastrophe. Now, where people differ is the amount, the role, the amount played by conspiracy or catastrophe in any given historical event. But there is a third element that is inevitably left out, never given its due, and is at least as important as the other two: stupidity. That
or convenient stupidity in this instance to justify the unjustifiable.
In this instance, sadly, stupidity is often inconvenient and doesn't work well for anyone involved. But in this particular case, as I recall, I don't know if I put it in the book, but one of the three, I think it was three senators, refused to declare war, voted no on the declaration. And one of them said that they were going to war with a country that had done nothing against them on the basis of evidence that would never have held up in a court of law. So it's a pretty terrible thing. The other thing that's worth noticing, though, is that one of the two major disputes that Charles had with the German High Command was unrestricted submarine warfare, which he said would inevitably bring in the United States. And if the United States were brought into the war, he said, there's no way we can win. The other, interestingly enough, the German High Command came up with a bright idea of sending communist agitators into Russia and Italy to destabilize their countries. Well, he said no. So the Italian project was scrapped, and the Russian, the Russian fellow had to be sent into Russia from German territory, not through Austria, which was the original plan. And that, of course, was the famous sealed train of Vladimir Lenin.
Absolutely. And you can say in this sense that Charles exercised far more foresight and wisdom than many of his contemporaries at the time. So this gets on to, I mean, obviously you set up what happens on the Eastern Front. The Kerensky government falls. We have the October-November revolution in Russia. We have the Russian Civil War, and we have the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which, again, in theory, should have given Germany some breathing room, which, of course, it did. It releases hundreds of thousands of troops to launch their spring offensive in March and April of 1918, and potentially also get food, which, of course, food was also a perennial problem for the Germans and the Austrians throughout the war, especially the Austrian half of the empire. And none of this materialized quickly enough. The German campaign, of course, wasn't able to achieve the knockout blow as expected. And every day, some 10,000 American troops during the spring and the summer were now entering into France in order to support the fronts there. And so we get to, you can say, the inevitable decline, because, of course, the American entry also involves the entry of Wilson's 14 points, the 10th point of which, if I recall, is to ensure the independence and development of peoples within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Karl took this as meaning that the Americans could potentially reconcile the Austrian-Hungarian Empire to existing after the war, albeit with some form of federal institutionalism. And this is where we get to the October Manifesto, which is one of the most consequential yet doomed enterprise of his reign. Of course, the other military factor here is, of course, the Macedonian front. has collapsed for the Bulgarian army. The Bulgarians surrender in early October, and the French and the Serbs are marching through and threatening the empire from the south. And you have it in your book, which is the declaration. So I'd just like to read it now. To my faithful Austrian peoples, since I ascended the throne, I have constantly endeavored to achieve for all my peoples the peace they long for, and to show to the people of Austria the paths along which they may, unhindered by obstacles and conflict, bring their powerful national identities to rich, beneficial fruition. The terrible struggle of world war has hitherto impeded the work of peace. In accordance with the will of its peoples, Austria is to become a federal state in which each nationality form its own polity on the territory on which it lives. This reshaping, which shall in no way affect the integrity of the lands of the Holy Hungarian Crown, is intended to give individual nation states and independence. And of course, practically speaking, this meant full independence to the Polish speaking and the Ruthenian territories in Galicia, Lodomeria. With regards to Bohemia, it was more complicated because, of course, the Masaryk provincial government existed at this point, claiming that the Czechs were, again, a force that needed to be liberated from within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And of course, you had the Czechoslovak legions fighting on the side of the Entente powers during this time. And in that sense, creating national self-determination for Bohemia and Moravia ultimately meant that by late October of 1918, we have the independence and creation of an independent Czechoslovak state, which will be the crucible of the Little Entente, which, again, tragically speaking, later on will end and frustrate all attempts at an Austro-Habsburg restoration. When it comes to, we've already mentioned the situation with Croatia. When it comes to the Italian front, the Italians agree an armistice on the 3rd of November, but of course the armistice and its actual implementation is delayed. And during this time, the Italians are able to rout the Austrian forces and gain the major victory after the it's the armistice of Villa Giusti, and we also have the severing of the Ausgleich as well. We have the peace party led by Count Caroli achieving power in late October of 1918 as well. And of course, he is intent on independence for Hungary and pursuing his own course of foreign affairs with regards to Wilson, again appealing to Wilson to not dismember the Hungarian state. And of course, the Caroli regime is a complete disaster. He unilaterally dismantles the Hungarian armed forces, and hoping that there will be effective national referendums in the extremities of the empire, as we mentioned, those extremities which had very few ethnic Hungarians or Hungarian speakers. The Romanians, the Serbs, and the Czechs instead decide to present the Hungarians with a fait accompli and take over those regions, taking advantage of the dismantling of the Hungarian Empire. And of course, to cap it all off, by March, Caroli is arrested by Bela Kun, who begins a communist reign of terror in Hungary. And this is where we get to Austria itself and the situation of Karl, because of course Charles is still around during this time, but now it's the German Austrians who want Anschluss or unification with what will later become the German Republic, who have now taken control under the socialist Karl Renner in the German-speaking parts of the empire, which also include the Sudeten region of Czechoslovakia. And on November the 11th, Charles renounces participation in state affairs. And this, as you're obviously aware, Charles, is significant because he will not abdicate, and being true to his coronation oath and true to his acceptance of the idea of monarchy as you indicated, an eighth sacrament, he will not abdicate. And so you again have included this document in your book, which I'll just read if that's okay. Ever since my accession, I have tried ceaselessly to lead my peoples out of the horrors of a war for whose inception I bear no trace of blame. I have not hesitated to restore constitutional life, and I have opened up for the people the path of their development as independent states. Filled now as ever with unwavering devotion to all my peoples, I do not wish to oppose their free growth with my person. I recognize in advance whatever decision that German Austria may make about its future political form. The people, through its representatives, have taken over the government. I renounce all participation in the affairs of the state. At the same time, I relieve my Austro-German government from office. May the people of German Austria, in unity and tolerance, create and strengthen the new order. The happiness of my people has, from the beginning, been the object of my most ardent wishes. Only an inner peace can heal the wounds of this war. So would you like to elaborate on this and what essentially happens after this renunciation?
Well, basically, there is the idea that there will be referenda as regards the nature of the government, that the peoples of the empire will be consulted, etc., etc., etc. None of that comes to pass. Moreover, Karl very much feels compelled, forced to do this, and will later. He'll later denounce the settlement, denounce the document because it was extracted from him, even though it was not an abdication. Beyond that, he will point out that the referendum on the Republic was never held, and has not been to this day, incidentally. There was the promised referendum did not take place. What did happen was that Karl and Zita and their family and entourage left Schönbrunn for a place called Eckartsau, which is northeast of here. And there they would hold out until 1919. Things got increasingly difficult for them. Karl Renner, who may not have been a very nice man, but at least was also vindictive. And treacherous and untrustworthy and betrayed his country 3 times. Anyway, Renner did everything he could to harass them. So, in the midst of all this, what are they going to do? Well, Karl writes to George V and asks for help. And George V felt very guilty over the death, not so long before, of his cousin Nicholas II.
Yes.
So he sent to his aid a Colonel Edward Strutt, who is a Catholic, a real adventurer. You know, the sort of almost an Indiana Jones figure, really the sort of person you'd want to have at your back in a weird, strange setup. And Strutt came to Eckartsau and immediately took charge of the situation. Went down to Vienna, overawed Renner. And in the end, was able to secure their peaceful departure from the country without either A, abdicating, or B, being searched, which Renner had wanted to do. And so they left in the Imperial train for Switzerland, flags flying, etc. They crossed the border. They stayed initially with Zita's relatives, who had a place not too far from the border. And eventually they found a place of their own. Their exile in Switzerland would last about 3 years and would be relatively comfortable. At that time, they were still able to get supplies, supporters, and so forth. But things went from bad to worse. The Bela Kun regime that you spoke of was overthrown by a combination of Romanian troops and a group of Hungarian white guards led by Admiral Horthy.
Miklos Horthy, yeah.
That's the one. He rode into Budapest on horseback, the sailor on horseback. Now, this, in turn, provoked all sorts of other things. One thing that should be borne in mind is that while he was in Switzerland, Charles had not been idle. He had worked very hard on influencing the Allies, for instance, against the Anschluss. He also did his best to get people's attention for some sort of Danubian federation. But while all that was happening, the drama took place in Hungary. Now, they were in touch with Horthy. Horthy was one of the last people that Charles saw before he left Schönbrunn. And he had sworn then his undying loyalty, and that if he could get control in Hungary, he'd bring him back, and blah, 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 blah. If you want, Horthy is the third of the unholy trinity, alongside Rena and Janine, who really, really put the nails in Charles's coffin, so to speak. In addition to Woodrow Wilson, I can't leave my president out.
So just just before, there's you mentioned Karl Renner, of course. Just going back to Karl Renner, immediately after the Imperial Party leaves on the Imperial train, Karl Renner enacts the Habsburg Law, banishing Charles and compelling the Habsburgs to renounce their claims and becoming private citizens. In addition to that, also abolishing nobility in Austria, and if you use a title in Austria, you had to pay a fine. In addition to that, you couldn't legally use a title in Austria. I believe that still exists to this day. You cite in your book an example where Karl had attempted to use his title and was fined, and there was an issue wrangling over the constitution and what currency had to be paid, but and how that issue was still ongoing. So even to this day, Karl Renner's influence persists.
He well, and not only that, I mean, he seized the personal property, the real estate of the main line of the House of Habsburg, not the cadet lines, but the main line, places like Eckernau, Luxembourg, and Villa Vartholz, places like that. So most of them were returned to the family in 1935 by the Austrian government.
Yeah,
they were seized by the Nazis, who, of course, were there with the collaboration of Karl Renner, the great pro-Nazi collaborator, Karl Renner. Did I mention he betrayed his country 3 times? That was the second time. He would betray the third time.
Yes, he would. He would become president after that as well. So,
he died. Virtue is its own reward, I assure you.
There's just a brief moment. Obviously, like, why 1935? Because, of course, in 1933 or 1934, Dollfuss had come to power in Austria. And so from 1934 to 1938, we have the Dollfuss and then the Schuschnigg regime in Austria, which, again, far more pro-Habsburg and vehemently anti-Anschluss and anti-unification with Germany. And, of course, they are deposed at the beginning of 1938, thus enabling the Anschluss.
Precisely. And, of course, the Habsburg territories were re-seized by the new Nazi government and have stayed in government hands ever since. A wonderful example of Nazi loot, as any Klimt painting might be. I must say, just parenthetically, it's not really germane, but it rankles. When you hear that phrase, Austro-fascism, to describe the Dollfuss regime, it's a marvelous example of what we call in advertising poisoning the well. So now, whenever anyone says to me Austro-fascism, I say, you mean Renounces, don't you? And if they say, oh, well, no, Dollfuss, I say, no, Dollfuss was murdered by the Nazis. Renner welcomed them in and collaborated with them. You see the difference, right?
Absolutely, yes. And if anyone's curious, I do have a stream where I briefly talk about whether the Dollfuss regime were fascists on this channel. If anyone's prepared to check that out, again, that's another topic entirely. But yes, back to, if it's possible, back to Horthy, just to get this conversation on track, and the ultimate betrayal.
Indeed, because as I say, Charles had been in touch with the Western powers. He had some influence with the treaty, and he was in touch with the French Prime Minister, Briand. Now, Briand was afraid of several things in Eastern Europe. He was afraid of the new Soviet Union. He was afraid of the possibility of a resurgent Germany. He was even afraid, even though it looked very unlikely in 1920 and 21, of a resurgent Italy that might challenge the French in Eastern Europe. More than that, the Little Entente, which was the alliance of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia, to guarantee the settlement, he did not consider them that reliable, either as individual partners or as a bloc.
Yeah.
But the idea of Charles, whose measure he already knew, of Charles being restored as king in Hungary and probably in Austria, that struck him as something, and allied to France, that struck him as something that would be much more reliable. So he made a deal basically with Charles and said, look, if you can get your country back, you can get the Hungarian throne back, two things. I'll make sure the Little Entente leave you alone, and I'll give you all sorts of financial credits to jumpstart the Hungarian economy.
In addition to possible territorial revisions as well, because something we forgot to mention is that throughout 1919, we have the treaties of Paris, we have the Treaty of Versailles, but we also have the treaties of Saint-Germain, and we have the treaties of Trianon. Trianon takes away 60% of the lands of St. Stephen and 40% of the ethnic and linguistic Hungarians. Austria, the German Austria portion, is reduced to a rump of Austria, which loses all the lands in Bohemia, Moravia, loses large parts of Trentino, and loses parts of the Carinthian Carniola to the new Yugoslav state at the same time. So Hungary is in a much reduced position, a tiny shadow of what it had been under the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. And it's into this situation where, again, Karl considers his restoration. And as you emphasized, again, this was a renunciation. It wasn't an abdication. He had been crowned King of Hungary, and he believed himself to be King of Hungary. It was simply a matter of waiting for an opportune time. And as you've also mentioned, we have the Briand Pact. And again, it comes back to the conception of an alliance between France and Austria-Hungary. I mean, Briand was conservative as opposed to Clemenceau, who of course was a socialist. And throughout France, throughout the 1920s and 1930s, there was a battle going on between the socialists and the conservatives, as France is lurching between more conservative regimes and aggressively secularizing regimes. I mean, one of the figures, of course, supporting Briand in this point is Marshal Lyautey. In addition to other French generals who had actually helped facilitate the demise of Hungary, such as General Desprez. So France itself, again, is in an interesting political situation, enabling this possible restoration of the Hungarians under Charles. And it's into this situation where we have the so-called Easter crisis. So just quickly, because I'm conscious that we're running out of time, would you be able to elaborate for us, Charles, the Easter crisis, and finally the October attempted restoration, and how Horthy factors into this?
Well, the two were very different. The Easter crisis was an almost Ruritanian prisoner of Zenda style attempt by Charles to come into the country, go to Horthy, and reassert his control, which Horthy had promised he would be willing to give up to it. Although Charles, by this time, had begun to distrust him. I can't go into the details, but it was a very exciting attempt and showed a lot of personal bravery on Charles's part. It didn't work. Horthy refused to give up his power. The Little Entente rattled their sabers, and as we all promised, since it didn't work, he denied all knowledge. Second attempt, October, much better prepared, militarily, etc. Karl and Charles and Zita go together by plane. They land in Western Hungary. They rally troops. They march on Budapest. Major error here, however, is that the major error here is that Colonel Lehar, who was the commander of the troops in the West and loyal as the day was long, insisted that his superior officer remain his superior officer, General, I forget his name, very annoying person as it turned out. Charles did not trust the general. He thought Lehar should command. Lehar begged him. He went along with the begging. And indeed, the general, when they got to Budapest, betrayed his king. And at that point, Charles was faced with a bloody civil war if he wanted the crown. Rather than a quick, as it were, snatch and grab. And he would not put his peoples through another war. So,
and of course, Lehar and another one of his loyal commanders, Orsenburg, had both supported him and were prepared to fight on. And it was Charles's intervention that again prevented this escalating to a civil war. I think in terms of really emphasizing the betrayal, of course, of Horthy, Horthy had been commander-in-chief of the Navy during the war and had inflicted many naval victories against the Italians. But during the final days of the monarchy, he had come to Charles just before his exile, I think just at the beginning of his exile, and proclaimed to him that I will be loyal to you unto death, and I shall never renounce again my loyalty to you. And of course, when we have the first event, one of the dramatic episodes of it is in the Easter crisis, that Horthy and Charles meet face to face. Charles arrives virtually unannounced due to an error in terms of the managing of the arrival of Charles. Horthy is eating his dinner. This is Easter Day, I believe, and he comes down and he has this serious row with the emperor. The emperor reminds him of all of his obligations and oaths, and again the fact that he has stabilized Hungary, Horthy, and now the conditions are acceptable for a restoration. And of course, Horthy, citing the idea of a an entente intervention or entente reprisal nominally, refuses to consent to this. And because of this, Charles has no interest in the second attempt in reconciling with Horthy or dealing with Horthy, believing Horthy to be a traitor. So it's a matter in the second attempt of bringing on the Hungarian armed forces. And of course, as you mentioned, the Hungarian armed forces, many of them do, especially in the West, and the campaign begins in Sopron in the West, come to his side and acclaim him king. Even, some of his cabinet ministers, Horthy's cabinet ministers, such as Count Bethlen, who had been prime minister, were wavering in their loyalties, but nevertheless, the army finally decides to pivotally elements of the army come hard on the side of Horthy, and Horthy is able to effect a complete capitulation of Karl and his weakened position as a result of this betrayal. And this leads to something which is eerily similar in my mind of the exile of Napoleon Bonaparte after the Battle of Waterloo, which is, first of all, he is imprisoned. First of all, he goes to the Esterhazy estate. He's nearly assassinated. Then he is transported on a British ship, the HMS Glowworm, through the Danube through Romania, many of whom, as you mentioned in your book, acclaim and say, long live the king, even Romania. And again, we have at the beginning of that reign that close association with him and Romania, and again, dating back to Franz Ferdinand. He arrives on the Black Sea coast, and he's transported in the HMS Cardiff to his place of exile, and ultimately where he'll die in Madeira. And of course, after being essentially penniless, and just able to bring his family, in 1922 he catches a cold which quickly develops into pneumonia, and of course he dies at a very young age of 34. And again, very similar circumstances to Napoleon.
He does, and a couple of interesting things emerge from his death. One of them is that on his deathbed he said, "I am suffering that my peoples might come back together." That is something that honestly has haunted me since first I read it. partly because considering what he went through for his peoples, I mean, if it had been me, I would have probably died cursing them. But that's probably why he's a saint and I'm not. The second is that at one point on his last day, he told Zita, who by this time is pregnant with her 8th child, I mean, that had nobody, this is a terrible situation. He said to her, as soon as I'm gone and you've buried me, contact the King of Spain and he'll take care of you. I've spoken to him, it's all arranged. And she said, what? You couldn't possibly have spoken to the King of Spain. He said, I have. It's all taken care of. So he died. He had the funeral, was buried. And Zita contacted the King of Spain, who announced that he was going to repatriate the family to Spain. And he was sending a warship to pick them up. I think it was the Santa Isabel. Anyway, the British rattled their swords and said, you know, if you do, we're not going to let them leave unless she abdicates for her children. And Alfonso says, I am sending a ship to pick them up. If you fire on it, you're at war with Spain. So, I mean, that same year, Britain would back down over the Scutari affair in Turkey, so they weren't going to deal with Spain. So the ship arrives, they get on, they go back to Spain, take the train to Madrid, and finally, Zita is chatting with King Alfonso. And she asks him, you know, I appreciate very much your jumping in to help us like this. I really do, but why did you do it? He said, well, you know, it was the strangest thing. The day your husband died, I suddenly had the strongest feeling that if I didn't take care of you people, one day the same thing would happen to my wife and children. So she told him what her husband had said. They both kind of rolled their eyes at each other. But it's an interesting tale. Truly, the story of Emperor Karl has two lessons to take away apart from the religious one. And those are these. One, he was an amazing man. He was an incredible fellow in every respect. Two, he was horribly, horribly ill-served over and over again. But from those 2 points, you can draw a third. Tragedy of Charles the First of Austria, 4th of Hungary, 3rd of Bohemia, etc. At the end of the day, was not his tragedy. He's a blessed. His wife is a servant of God. Her cause of beatification has been introduced. Their tragedy was our tragedy. Because you see, we all have precisely the opposite kind of leadership that he incarnated, that he epitomized. We are free, we are absolutely free of that kind of sacrificial leadership today. Instead of being led by people who would die for us, well, you know what we're led by.
And that's a wonderful point, and a lead into just the final point I want to raise with you, Charles, which is, could you elaborate on, again, the case for his beatification, in addition to the points we've already raised?
Well, certainly. All through his life, he was, as I say, extremely pious. The Pietas Austriaca, which I describe in the beginning of the book, is a sort of standard piety of the House of Habsburg. Devotion to the Holy Cross, the Passion, the Eucharist, very Marian. Now, that isn't to say that all Habsburgs that have ever lived have been very devout, but this is the style of piety in which they're raised. And as I said earlier, also, Charles was never pro forma about anything. So he took all this very literally, very seriously. I mentioned he saw everything as a vocation. He saw his marriage as a vocation. His death was extremely holy. He had communion every day that he could take it. He died in sight of the Blessed Sacrament. It's an interesting thing, though, that the organization, the Gemeensliga, which was organized, which has acted as the shepherd for his beatification, it has an odd origin. Most of these sorts of groups start after a person dies, they get a reputation for sanctity, a group comes together, maybe they've had some prayers answered to a person, whatever, and they press the person's sainthood. The Gemeensliga started when he was 5 years old, because when his parents and he were in Sopron in Hungary, in the garrison, he was taught by an Hungarian priest Latin and catechism and so forth. And the priest in question had a friend who was an Ursuline nun who happened to be a stigmatic and was believed to have the gift of prophecy.
Yeah.
Well, now, mind you, at this point, young Karl was nowhere near the succession. But the priest told his nun friend about him, and she said, that boy will be the Emperor of Austria one day. But he'll be a great blessing to Austria, a reward for her fidelity, and hell will hate him. So you've got to get everyone you know to pray very, very hard for him. And they did. That was the start of the Gemeensliga. And then when he died in Madeira, the members of the Gemeensliga began to look into his beatification. They gathered stories of miracles and all that attributed to his intercession. The first miracle which led to his beatification was the healing in the 50s of a Brazilian nun, oddly enough, named Sister Mary Zina.
Mm.
And when Empress Zina heard about the name of this person who had been cured through her husband's intercession, she said, there he is again, always thinking of me. And then the second miracle, which should bring him canonization at some point, was of a non-Catholic lady in Florida, back in the zeros, shortly after his beatification. She was cured of cancer through praying to him. So his cultus continues to grow throughout the world. There are now 17 shrines to him in the United States alone, which is amazing. There are 17 shrines to Emperor Charles, and not one, I think, to Woodrow Wilson.
As it should be.
As it should be.
There's just, on the one hand, there's the miraculous aspect, but there's another aspect I just want to draw up, which is, of course, Pius X dies very shortly into the First World War, and the majority of the war was taken up by Benedict XV. And Benedict XV, again, is an ally to Charles in the sense that Benedict XV was pro-peace, and again, pro-peace without annexations. So in the model of not just being a incredibly pious and miraculous ruler, he's also significant in the sense that he is a ruler which all Catholic rulers should try and emulate, only in the sense of his devotion to the papacy, in the sense that he was, again, following the intentions of Benedict XV in trying to bring about this honorable peace without annexations on either side. But of course, Leo XIII is famed for his social encyclicals. One thing you bring up in the book is, again, the fact that he was a great advocate for Catholic social justice. Among other things, many soldiers of the various different ethnicities have been accused by German officers of treason, especially after the loss of Galicia Lodomeria and then its subsequent reintegration into the empire. One of the first things that Charles does is that he pardons most of these soldiers which had been found guilty of treason through what he considered wasn't a fair process. But I really would like, just as a final point, for you to elaborate on Karl as ruling in the vein of Catholic social justice.
Well, he, in a certain sense, the military virtues, making sure that your men are fed and taken care of before you are, looking after them first, was very much united in him with his religious belief and with his belief in monarchy, the role of the monarch. So he was, for instance, the first his was the first government to create a Ministry of Social Welfare. He, during the harsh winters of 1916, 17, and 18, he used the imperial carriages to bring coal and various other supplies to the poor. He he really, well, I mean, what can I say? He did everything he could to alleviate the sufferings of his people, precisely because he felt it was the job of a Catholic monarch to do so. Everything he tried, whether from federalization and the search for peace on the one hand, to the attempt to keep his starving subjects fed on the other, was all part and parcel of the same thing. You know, one of the things that struck me in the aftermath of my book coming out was how, when people who like the figure of Emperor Karl look at him, they try to isolate the elements they like and leave the rest alone. So, you know, some people are attracted by Emperor Charles the Saint. Some people are attracted by Emperor Charles the Soldier. Some by Emperor Charles the Ruler. And each of these will kind of disregard the rest of it. But you can't. You really can't. I wrote an article about him. I called it The Indivisible Emperor. Because he was. His religious sense, his military sense, his governmental sense, his personal sense. Piece of a piece of a piece. Catholic social teaching, at the end of the day, boils down, as so as everything else does, to our Lord's dictum, greater love hath no man than to give up his life for his friends. That's the role of a Catholic monarch. That's the role of anyone, really, who would follow Christ. And in looking at him, at someone who went through so much, so much of which was beyond his control, and yet who never lost his faith, never lost his aplomb, and for that matter, never lost his sense of humor. I think he's an example that all of us can follow in our particular places, wherever we happen to find ourselves.
Well, thank you for that summary, Charles. It was a beautiful summary, and it again exemplified many of the virtues regarding Charles and how all of these aspects intersect with one another to create the man and the saint. So thank you very much for that. Moving on, just quickly to super chats, we've only got two. Nicholas Coombe for £10 and nothing to say. You should say something, Nicholas Coombe. Thank you very much for the £10. Andrew Cooper for another £10. AM, another excellent stream with a great guest. Well, wonderful, and thank you again very much, Charles, for joining us. Have you read Roth's Radetzky March? If you have, how do you rate it? I'm guessing this is Joseph Roth's Radetzky March. Yes, I read it a very long time ago, but I can't remember much of it. So, Charles, would you rate it?
Well, I rate it very highly. I mean, he gives a sympathetic view of life under the monarchy, and of course, it's very elegiac. You know, it's a story of an obscure officer who becomes a nobleman through saving the life of the emperor. And it's a wonderful story, and it does give you a feeling for that era. You know, one of the things we didn't touch on is that there's really been a revolution in Habsburg studies in the past 10, 15 years. The old idea that the empire was this rickety, rockety, inevitably doomed structure waiting for the joyous populace for the joyous peoples to escape the prison of the nationalities. It's not true. What killed the empire was the war. If it hadn't been for the war, if they had been able to accomplish what people like Franz Ferdinand were looking to do, who knows? Because, you know, the other thing, too, to remember is that so much remains in the former empire. They even speak in countries like Poland and Ukraine and Romania and Serbia of the Habsburg effect, which is the great difference between the areas the Habsburgs ruled in each of those countries and the ones they didn't, in terms of attitude toward government, attitude toward life, and even voting patterns. Very often when there's a vote, you look at the map of the vote, and it follows the old boundaries. It's amazing.
Wonderful. So thank you for that. Last minute super chat, Winter Phoenix Forest Kirin for $10. AA, you need to watch more anime. Clip it. Thanks. I'm not sure quite what you're referring to there, Winter Phoenix Forest Kirin. So do say so quickly in the chat before I wrap things up. So yes, just a bit of housekeeping for the channel. Going on to the final slide. Here we are. Just for future streams, it was very portentous, Charles, that you brought up Bonnie Prince Charlie, because a vote for the channel patrons has announced that Jacobitism will be the next topic on this series. So we will be covering Bonnie Prince Charlie, we'll be covering the Old Pretender and all of the subsequent Jacobite claimants to the throne. So that'll be in 2 weeks' time. Bringing up the Habsburg effect, Charles, I'm hoping to do a series called The Anatomy of Austria-Hungary in a couple of months' time, where I go into this region by region, investigating the life under the Austro-Hungary. Say, for example, take one of the crown lands, say Galicia, Lodomeria, and discuss the enduring effects of the Habsburg rule for the 50 years that succeeded it, and just try and analyze it from that perspective. But before we go, anything you would want to tell the chat, or anything you want to basically explain what you're doing and what you're up to?
Well, right now, of course, I'm at school in Hungary. I've got a couple of book ideas I'm wrestling with, but nothing that would bear revealing at this point. I'm going to be doing a book tour finally, now that anti-COVID has subsided somewhat. I'm going back to the States on Friday, and after a month in California, the first 2 weeks in August, I'll be touring around the Northeast, doing book signings and so forth. And then on the 16th of August, I come back here. So I'll be in Austria at least for another 2 years. The other thing I should mention, apropos of nothing, since you're bringing up Jacobinism, I found out something very interesting genealogically in the last month. I was always aware that on my French-Canadian father's side, we had Scots blood, McKinnons from the Isle of Egg. And as I understood it, our ancestor who came to Canada in 1772 was the younger brother of two men who died at Coulombe. Well, I was always very proud of that. I found out something last month. His brothers died there, but he was not born in 1738, the way we'd always understood. He was born in 1723 and fought at Coulombe himself.
Wonderful.
And I found that out when I found online his obituary in the Montreal Gazette. He died at 107 in 1830.
Incredible, so he must have family history.
Yeah, he must have been one of the last survivors of the battle, but it made it more personal. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. So, just final points. Obviously, Charles's wonderful book, Blessed Charles, A Holy Emperor, is in the description. So look at that. He's also obviously on Tumble House, so check him out over there. And his Twitter is also in the description. There is a new poll up on Subscribestar if anyone wants to vote on a new topic. Of course, if anyone wants to join Subscribestar, the link is also in the description. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching. Thank you so much, Charles, for coming on and being such a wonderful guest. And good night.
Good night.